That's it. Mom, this isn't enough. Those were the words my son said after I sold my wedding jewelry to help him. And in that moment, standing in his spotless kitchen with the faint smell of fresh coffee in the air, I realized something inside me had quietly broken. I didn't argue. I didn't ask what he meant. I simply nodded, as if his words made perfect sense, as if the envelope in his hands didn't contain 30 years of memories melted down into a number he could count. He didn't even look at me when he said it. His eyes were fixed on the cash, flipping through each bill with the same detached focus he used as a child counting allowance money on the living room floor. Back then, he would look up at me and smile. This time, he didn't. Sophie stood beside him, her arms crossed loosely, her expression calm, almost thoughtful, as if she were evaluating a business transaction rather than watching her husband speak to his mother. She tilted her head slightly, glancing at the envelope, then at me, and for a brief second, I saw it. The calculation behind her eyes, the quiet assessment of what I might still have left to give. I felt it more than I understood it. The kitchen was bright, sunlight pouring through wide windows, reflecting off marble countertops so clean they didn't look lived in. Everything in that house looked new, polished, expensive. It didn't look like the home of someone who was struggling. But I said nothing. I had learned, over the years, that silence often reveals more than questions ever could. "We're still short," Sophie said softly, her voice measured, almost gentle, as if she were trying to cushion the blow. Daniel nodded, still counting. "Yeah, we were expecting more," he added, like he was explaining a simple misunderstanding. Expecting more. I repeated those words in my mind, not because I didn't hear them, but because I needed to understand how they could exist in the same sentence as everything I had just given up. That jewelry wasn't just gold and diamonds. It was my life with his father. The ring he slipped onto my finger in a small church in Ohio when I was 23. The bracelet he bought me after Daniel was born, when we barely had enough to cover rent, but he wanted to celebrate becoming a father. The earrings I wore to every family holiday, every birthday, every quiet Sunday dinner. I had kept them all these years, long after his father passed, long after the house felt too big and the nights too quiet, because they were the last pieces of a life that once felt whole. And that morning, I placed them in a velvet box, drove 10 miles to a jeweler downtown, and watched as a man weighed them like they were nothing more than scrap. He gave me a number. I accepted it, not because it was fair, but because my son needed help. Or at least, that's what I believed. Now I stood here, empty-handed, listening to him say it wasn't enough. I looked at his face then, really looked at him, trying to find the boy who used to run to me when he scraped his knee, who used to hold my hand in crowded stores, who used to say thanks, Mom, for things far smaller than this. But that boy wasn't there. In his place was a man who saw me differently. Not as his mother, not as someone who had given him everything she could, but as someone who still had something left to give. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. This wasn't about need. It wasn't even about money. It was about expectation. And expectations, once fed, don't disappear. They grow. I felt my fingers curl slightly at my sides, not in anger, but in something quieter, something steadier. I gave a small nod, the kind you give when a conversation is over, even if nothing has really been said. "I see." I murmured, my voice calm, almost distant, as if I were speaking about someone else's life. Daniel finally looked up then, just for a second, like he might say something more, like there might be a flicker of hesitation or guilt. But it passed as quickly as it came. "We'll figure something out," he said, already turning away, already moving on. Sophie offered a polite smile, the kind you give a stranger at the end of a brief interaction, and then she followed him out of the kitchen. I stood there alone, the sunlight still pouring in, the house still quiet, the air unchanged. But everything else had shifted. I didn't cry. I didn't feel the urge to. Instead, I felt something settle into place inside me, something clear and unshakable. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about what my son needed. I was thinking about what he had just shown me, and more importantly, what I was going to do with that truth. Family secrets uncovered, I did not call Daniel the next day, and he did not call me either, which told me more than any conversation ever could. Instead, I followed my usual routine, making coffee at exactly 7 in the morning, placing the mug on the same spot on the kitchen counter, and standing there as the steam rose slowly into the air. Everything felt familiar, almost too familiar, like a life that had been running on repetition rather than intention. I took a sip and let the bitterness settle, then reached for my phone, not to check messages, but to look. Really look. I opened his social media page, something I rarely did because I always preferred hearing things directly from him, or at least I used to. The first photo that appeared was from 3 days ago. Daniel stood in front of a dark blue SUV, one hand in his pocket, the other resting casually on the hood. The caption was simple. New ride. Grateful. I stared at the image longer than I expected to, noticing the shine of the paint, the reflection of the sky on the windshield, the way he was smiling just slightly, not wide, not proud, just satisfied. Sophie stood beside him in the next photo, her arm looped through his, her expression bright and effortless, like everything in their life was exactly as it should be. I scrolled further. A dinner at a place I recognized. One of those upscale restaurants downtown where the lighting is low and the plates are small but carefully arranged. A weekend getaway posted just 2 weeks ago, ocean in the background, sunlight catching in her hair, both of them looking relaxed, comfortable, unburdened. I did not feel anger when I saw those images. What I felt was something quieter, something sharper. It was the absence of confusion. The pieces were not scattered anymore. They were fitting together. I set the phone down gently and looked at the coffee in my hand, now half gone, now lukewarm. I thought back to the conversation in his kitchen, the way he said they were still short, the way Sophie had framed it as temporary, as necessary. I thought about the envelope, about the weight of it when I handed it over, about the absence of hesitation in both of them. None of it had been rushed. None of it had been uncertain. It had been expected. That was the word that stayed with me. Expected. I walked to the living room and stood by the bookshelf, running my fingers lightly along the spines of books I had collected over the years. Some were worn, some barely opened, but each one had a place, a history, a reason for being there. I wondered, not for the first time, when I had stopped questioning the role I had been placed in. It had not happened all at once. It had been small things, subtle things, a request here, a favor there, each one reasonable on its own, each one easy to justify, until they were no longer requests, until they became something else entirely. I turned back toward the kitchen and picked up my phone again, this time opening my messages. There it was. The last message from Daniel, sent 2 weeks ago. Hey Mom, do you think you could help us out a little? Just until things stabilize. I read it again, slowly, noticing the words I had overlooked before. A little. Just until. Things stabilize. None of those words had been defined. None of them had been real. They had simply been enough to open the door. I placed the phone face down on the counter and stood there in the quiet, letting the realization settle fully into place. This was not a misunderstanding. It was not a moment of stress or a lapse in judgment. It was a pattern I had participated in without ever seeing it clearly. I exhaled slowly and reached for the notepad by the fridge, the one I used for grocery lists and reminders. I picked up a pen and held it there for a second before writing anything. Then, without rushing, without overthinking, I wrote down a single sentence. I will not give them anything else. The words looked simple on the page, almost small, but they felt different than anything I had said to myself before. They felt final. I set the pen down beside it and stepped back, looking at the note as if it belonged to someone else. There was no anger behind it, no bitterness, just clarity. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. I did not tell Daniel about the note I wrote that morning, and I did not need to, because something had already shifted in the way I thought about him, in the way I understood the space between us. Instead of reaching for the phone the way I used to, I let the day unfold quietly, moving through the house with a kind of steady awareness I had not felt in years. By late afternoon, the sunlight had begun to fade, stretching long shadows across the living room floor, and I found myself standing in front of the old wooden cabinet near the hallway, the one I had not opened in a long time. Inside were things I had not touched since my husband passed. Old letters, neatly tied with a ribbon. A stack of photographs, edges slightly worn. Documents I had once believed I would never need to look at again. I hesitated for only a moment before opening the door and reaching inside. The scent of paper and time greeted me, familiar and quiet, like stepping into a part of my life I had set aside but never truly left behind. I pulled out a small envelope, one I recognized immediately, even before I turned it over. His handwriting was still clear, still steady, the way it always was. I sat down at the dining table and opened it carefully, unfolding the paper inside with slow, deliberate movements. He had written it years ago, not long after we first bought this house, when everything still felt ahead of us instead of behind. I read the lines again, even though I already knew them by heart. He wrote about taking care of each other, about building something that would last, about making sure that no matter what happened, I would never be left without security or dignity. He had always been very particular about that word, dignity. I traced my finger lightly over the ink, feeling the slight indentation where the pen had pressed into the paper, and for a moment, I allowed myself to remember what it felt like to be seen fully, to be valued without condition or expectation. Then I folded the letter back up and set it beside me. Next, I reached for the folder underneath, the one that held our financial records, the documents we had organized together over the years with careful attention. I flipped through them slowly, stopping when I reached the pages I was looking for. The house, the savings, the accounts we had built, piece by piece, without shortcuts, without excess. Everything was still there, exactly as it had been. Nothing had been touched. Nothing had been given away. I sat there for a long time, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to understand the full weight of what I was holding. Not just in terms of money or property, but in terms of choice. For years, I had believed that giving freely was a sign of love, that offering help without question was what a mother was supposed to do. And maybe it had been, once. But somewhere along the way, that giving had turned into something else, something expected, something assumed. I closed the folder gently and placed it back inside the cabinet, leaving the letter on the table in front of me. The room was quiet again, the kind of quiet that does not press down on you, but settles around you like something steady and certain. I looked at the empty chair across from me, the one my husband used to sit in, and I thought about the promise he had made, not just to protect what we built, but to protect me. That promise had not disappeared when he did. It was still here, in the walls of this house, in the documents I had just reviewed, in the choices I still had the power to make. I picked up the letter one more time, folded it carefully, and placed it back into the envelope. Then I stood up, walked to the cabinet, and returned everything to its place, closing the door with a soft, quiet click. When I turned back toward the room, I felt something settle into me completely, something firm and unshakable. I was not going to confront Daniel. Not yet. I was not going to explain what I had discovered or what I now understood, because this was not something that needed to be argued or defended. It was something that needed to be seen. And more importantly, it was something that needed to be answered in a way he would never expect. I did not wait long before the next message came, because patterns like this do not stop on their own. They simply continue until something interrupts them, and by the following afternoon, my phone lit up with Daniel's name again. I did not pick it up right away. I let it ring once, twice, then go silent before the message notification followed. I walked to the kitchen slowly, drying my hands on a towel as if there was no urgency at all, and only then did I glance at the screen. "Hey Mom, we need to talk. Things are getting tighter than we expected." I read it once, then again, noticing how the words had shifted slightly from before. Not a request this time. Not framed as a question. Just a statement, followed by an assumption that I would respond the way I always had. I set the phone down on the counter without replying and returned to what I was doing, rinsing a cup that was already clean, watching the water run over it, as if it required my full attention. A few minutes later, the phone buzzed again. "Did you see my message?" This time, I allowed myself a small breath before reaching for it. Not out of hesitation, but out of clarity. I opened the message, read it, and then typed a response with steady hands. I saw it. "What do you need?" I did not add anything else. No reassurance. No warmth. Just the question. The reply came almost immediately. "We are short about 15,000. Just until things stabilize again." 15,000. I let the number sit in my mind without reacting to it. Not because it was large, but because of how easily it had been said, how casually it had been placed into the conversation as if it were no different than asking for a ride or a favor. I leaned against the counter, holding the phone loosely in my hand, and for the first time, I did not feel the pull to solve it for him. Instead, I asked another question. "What is the money for?" There was a pause this time, longer than before, long enough for me to picture them together, Sophie reading the message over his shoulder, deciding how much to say, how much to leave unsaid. When the response came, it was exactly what I expected. Bills. Just general expenses. You know how things are right now. I didn't know how things were. I had seen the photos, the car, the dinners, the trips, and I understood something very clearly in that moment. This was not about survival. It was about maintaining a standard they had chosen, one they believed I would continue to support without question. I looked down at the message and felt something settle even deeper inside me, something that was no longer uncertain or forming, but fully present. I typed slowly, making sure each word was exactly what I meant. I might have something I can sell. I will need a few days. I read the sentence once before sending it, not to check for mistakes, but to understand the effect it would have. The response came faster than any before. Really? That would help a lot. Let me know what you can do. There it was. No hesitation. No concern. Just relief, as if the solution had always been me. I set the phone down gently and looked out the window, watching the late afternoon light stretch across the yard. The same yard where Daniel used to play when he was small, running in circles until he fell onto the grass laughing, calling out for me to watch him, to see him. I had always been there then, always watching, always ready to catch him if he needed it. But this was different. This was not a child reaching out. This was a man who had learned that I would always step in, no matter the cost. I picked up the notepad from the counter, the same one where I had written my decision the day before, and I added a second line beneath it. Let them believe it one more time. I stared at the words for a moment, then set the pen down. There was no rush, no urgency, just a quiet understanding of what came next. I was not going to argue with them. I was not going to explain anything. Because sometimes, the only way for someone to truly see what they have become is to let them reveal it completely. And this time, I was going to let them. I did not wait for another message after that, and none came that evening, which told me they were satisfied for now, confident that the situation had already been handled in their favor. That confidence was important. It meant they were not questioning anything. It meant they believed the pattern was still intact. I moved through the next 2 days with quiet intention, not changing my routine in any noticeable way, not giving myself away through urgency or hesitation. In the mornings, I made my coffee the same way, stood by the same window, and watched the same stretch of sky shift from pale gray to soft blue. In the afternoons, I opened drawers I had not touched in years, not searching for something to sell, but for something else entirely. I took out old folders, reviewed documents, checked account statements, and made small, precise notes on a yellow legal pad. Each number, each detail, placed exactly where it belonged. Not because I needed to organize my finances, but because I needed to see the full picture clearly, without emotion, without assumption. By the third day, everything was laid out in front of me, not physically, but in my mind. The house, the savings, the accounts that had been built carefully over decades. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been touched beyond what I had chosen to give. That realization did not bring relief. It brought clarity, because it meant that every request, every number they had mentioned, had never been about necessity. It had been about access. I closed the last folder and set it aside, then looked down at the legal pad where I had written a simple list. Assets, liquid funds, property value. Each word followed by a number that represented years of work, years of discipline, years of saying no when it would have been easier to say yes. I tapped the pen lightly against the paper, then drew a line beneath the list. Under it, I wrote a single sentence. None of this is for them. The words did not feel harsh. They felt accurate. That evening, I received another message. Any update, Mom? I read it while sitting at the dining table, the same table where I had opened my husband's letter just days before. I could almost hear his voice. In the quiet, steady, reminding me of the promise he had made, the one I was only now fully understanding. I placed the phone on the table and let a few minutes pass before responding. Not to create distance, but to maintain it. Then I picked it up and typed slowly. I found something. It should cover what you need. I will bring it by tomorrow. I read the message once, then sent it without hesitation. The response came almost immediately. Thank you, Mom. That really helps. Thank you. The words were there this time, but they felt different, lighter, almost automatic, as if they had been added because they were expected, not because they were felt. I set the phone down and looked around the room, taking in the quiet, the stillness, The familiarity of everything that had remained unchanged while something else had been shifting beneath it all. Then I stood up and walked to the cabinet once more, opening it with the same steady motion as before. I reached inside, not for the letter, not for the documents, but for something else I had set aside earlier that day. A small envelope. Plain. Unmarked. I held it in my hands for a moment, feeling its weight, understanding exactly what it represented. Not money, not value, but choice. I closed the cabinet and returned to the table, placing the envelope down in front of me. Tomorrow, I would go to Daniel's house again. I would stand in that same kitchen, under that same light, and I would hand him something he believed he was expecting. But this time, it would not be what he thought. And for the first time since this began, I was not wondering how he would react. I was wondering how much he would reveal when he realized that things were no longer unfolding the way he assumed they would. I arrived at Daniel's house just after 10 in the morning, the sun already high enough to cast sharp, clean shadows across the driveway, and I parked in the same spot as before, turning off the engine without rushing, without hesitation. The envelope rested in my lap, light, almost weightless, yet it felt more significant than anything I had carried in years. I sat there for a moment, looking at the house, noticing details I had overlooked before. The freshly trimmed hedges, the spotless windows, the new car parked slightly to the side, its surface reflecting the sky like a mirror. Nothing about this place suggested urgency or hardship. Nothing about it suggested need. I stepped out of the car, closed the door quietly, and walked up to the front entrance with steady steps, holding the envelope loosely at my side. When I rang the doorbell, I could hear movement inside almost immediately, quick, purposeful. The door opened, and Sophie stood there, her expression shifting the moment she saw me, from mild surprise to something softer, something practiced. "Hi," she said, stepping back to let me in. "We were just talking about you." Of course they were. I nodded once and walked inside, the familiar scent of their home surrounding me, clean, curated, untouched by anything that resembled struggle. Daniel appeared from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel, his face brightening in a way that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. "Mom," he said, walking toward me. "You came." I noticed the way his eyes dropped immediately to the envelope in my hand, just for a second, before returning to my face. That was all I needed to see. I said I would. I replied, my voice even, neutral, offering nothing more than the words themselves. We moved into the kitchen, the same place where I had stood days before, where he had counted money without looking at me, where everything had shifted without a sound. This time, I did not wait for him to speak. I placed the envelope on the counter between us, aligning it neatly with the edge, as if it were part of the room, part of the structure. "This should help," I said. No explanation, no apology, just the statement. Daniel reached for it immediately, his fingers quick, familiar with the motion, as if he had done it many times before. He opened it without hesitation, pulling out the contents and glancing down, his expression changing in a way that was almost imperceptible at first. Confusion, then a slight tightening around his eyes. Then something else, something sharper. "What is this?" he asked, his voice losing its earlier warmth. Sophie leaned in closer, looking over his shoulder, her posture shifting, her calm composure slipping just enough to reveal the tension underneath. Inside the envelope was not cash, not a check, not anything they could count or spend. It was a single document, a copy of a trust statement, carefully prepared, clearly outlined. It listed every asset, every account, every piece of property, and beside each one, a designation. Not for them, not now, not ever in the way they had expected. I rested my hands lightly on the counter, watching them without expression, without urgency. "It shows everything I have," I said quietly. Daniel looked up at me then, fully this time, his confusion turning into something closer to disbelief. "Mom, what is this supposed to mean?" I met his gaze without flinching. "It means there is nothing more for you to ask for." The words settled into the room slowly, not loud, not forceful, but impossible to ignore. Sophie straightened beside him, her arms no longer relaxed, her expression sharpening as she tried to process what she was seeing. "We do not understand," she said carefully. I gave a small nod, as if that made sense. "I know," I replied. "That is the point." Daniel's grip on the paper tightened slightly, his eyes scanning the lines again as if the meaning might change if he read it differently. But it did not. It stayed exactly the same. Clear. Final. Unmoving. I stood there in the quiet that followed, not filling it, not softening it, just allowing it to exist, because for the first time, the expectation that had always been there, unspoken but constant, had been removed completely. And in its place, there was nothing left for them to take. Daniel looked at me as if I had just said something in a language he did not understand, his eyes moving between the document in his hands and my face, searching for something that would make sense of it, something that would return things to the way they had always been. There has to be a mistake, he said finally, his voice tighter now, less controlled. This is not what we talked about. I did not respond right away. I let his words settle into the room, let the silence stretch just enough for him to hear what he had said, because that was exactly it. We had never talked about this. Not really. Everything had always been assumed. Sophie stepped forward then, her composure returning in a different form, sharper, more deliberate. Margaret, she said, using my name instead of anything softer, anything familiar. We are not asking for everything. We just need help right now. You said you had something to sell. I met her gaze calmly, without shifting, without softening. I did, I replied. And I already sold it. Daniel frowned slightly, confusion flickering again. Then where is it? He asked. Where is the money? I looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, not as the child I had raised, but as the man standing in front of me, the one who had learned to expect without asking, to take without seeing. You are looking at it, I said quietly. He shook his head, almost immediately, rejecting the answer before he could fully understand it. That does not make any sense, he said, his voice rising just enough to break the calm that had filled the room. Sophie placed a hand lightly on his arm, not to comfort him, but to steady the situation, her eyes still fixed on me, calculating, adjusting. What she means, she said slowly, is that she decided to handle things differently. I gave a small nod. Yes, I said. That is exactly what I mean. Daniel let out a breath, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that felt more frustrated than confused now. So that is it, he asked. You are just not going to help us? The question hung there, simple on the surface, but layered with everything that had come before it. I did not answer it directly. Instead, I asked one of my own. What would you have done if I said no the first time? He blinked, caught off guard, his expression shifting as he tried to process the question. That is not the point, he said quickly. You did not say no. I nodded once. You are right, I said. I did not. The acknowledgement seemed to unsettle him more than any argument could have. Sophie's posture changed again, her shoulders straightening slightly as she stepped into the space between us, not physically, but in tone, in presence. We are family, she said, her voice steady, controlled. We support each other. That is how this works. I let that statement sit for a moment before responding, not because I needed time, but because I wanted it to be heard clearly. Support is not the same as being used, I said, my voice still calm, still even, but no longer neutral. Daniel's eyes flickered at that, something shifting behind them, something he was not prepared to face. Used? He repeated, as if the word itself did not belong in this conversation. I held his gaze without wavering. You stopped asking a long time ago, I said. You started expecting. The silence that followed was different now, heavier, not because of what was said, but because of what could no longer be denied. Sophie did not respond this time. She did not argue or correct or reframe. She simply stood there, her expression still, her thoughts moving behind her eyes. Daniel looked down at the paper again, then back at me, and for the first time since I had walked into that house, he seemed unsure of what to say next. And that uncertainty, that small break in the certainty they had both carried for so long, was all I needed to see. Daniel did not speak right away, and that silence told me more than anything he could have said, because for the first time, there was no immediate answer, no quick way to shift the conversation back into something comfortable, something familiar. He looked down at the paper again, then folded it once, not carefully, not respectfully, just enough to hold it in his hand, as if reducing its size might reduce its meaning. So what are we supposed to do now? He asked finally, his voice lower, less certain, stripped of the confidence he had walked into the room with. I did not step closer. I did not soften my expression. I simply answered him the way I would have answered anyone else. You do what everyone else does, I said. You figure it out. The words were not harsh. They were not raised. But they landed with a weight that did not need volume to be felt. Sophie let out a slow breath beside him, her posture shifting again, but this time there was no strategy behind it, no attempt to guide the situation. Back into control. You are serious, she said quietly, more to herself than to me. I nodded once. I am. Daniel shook his head slightly, as if trying to wake up from something he did not expect to be real. After everything, you were just going to walk away? He asked. I looked at him for a long moment, not searching for the right words, but allowing the truth to settle before I spoke it. I am not walking away, I said. I am stepping back. He frowned at that, the difference between the two clearly not landing the way it was meant to. But that was not something I needed to explain further. Some things are only understood when they are lived. I reached for my purse, lifting it from the chair where I had placed it earlier, and held it at my side. The movement was small, but it marked something final, something that did not need to be announced. Sophie glanced at Daniel, then back at me, her expression no longer calculating, no longer controlled, just still, as if she had reached the end of something she could not redirect. We did not think it was like this, she said, her voice quieter now, almost reflective. I considered that for a moment before responding. I know, I said. That is why it continued. Daniel looked up at me again, and this time there was something different in his eyes, not clarity, not understanding, but the beginning of something that had not been there before. So that is it? He asked again, but the question had changed. It was no longer about money. It was about something else, something he could not quite name yet. I gave a small nod, not to dismiss him, but to acknowledge the moment for what it was. That is it, I said. The room fell quiet again, but this time the silence did not belong to me. It belonged to them, to everything they had assumed, everything they had built on those assumptions, and everything that had just shifted without warning. I turned toward the door, walking the same path I had taken when I entered, each step steady, unhurried, unchanged. When I reached the doorway, I paused for just a moment, not to look back at them, but to take in the space one last time, to recognize it for what it was and what it would no longer be. Then I opened the door and stepped outside, the sunlight brighter than before, the air cooler, clearer. I walked to my car, opened the door, and sat down, placing my hands on the steering wheel just as I had days earlier. But this time, there was no weight in them, no question, no hesitation. I started the engine and pulled away